Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're finally taking a look at the first of many sequels to the original Space Quest, entitled Space Quest Chapter 2, Vohaul's Revenge, or just Space Quest 2 for short. Now, believe it or not, I never actually played this game as a kid. In fact, as a kid, the only AGI games I'd played were the first three King's Quest games and the original Space Quest. So even though I have a bit of nostalgia for the AGI games in terms of aesthetics, I'm not actually all that nostalgic for the games themselves, which is a fair position to be in when covering Space Quest 2, because this one's definitely a bit odd to comment on. So here's the thing. The original King's Quest was very open-ended. You had multiple tasks to complete and could complete them in various ways, with different methods providing different quantities of points towards a final score. The original Space Quest was a bit more linear, but still had a variety of things you could attempt, most of which would just end in failure, but you had those potentials to work through all the same. Space Quest 2 is even more linear than the original Space Quest, and offers little in the way of exploring your environment, and even has a surprisingly small number of items that you'll acquire over the course of it. But it's much more cinematic than your typical AGI title, so it's kind of difficult to really rate this one as a result of that. The one thing I do want to say right away is that, just like with most of the AGI titles, you can end up in a Walking Dead state very easily due to this game's linearity. In fact, you can end up permanently missing a necessary item as early as leaving the second screen of the game. Yeah, not even kidding on that one. Space Quest 2 is yet another game which came to us courtesy of Sierra Online, or more specifically, the two guys from Andromeda, Crowe and Scott Murphy, and was published in 1987, the year after the original Space Quest, and is of course a one-player inventory-based adventure game. It supports a wide variety of video modes, technically including an MCGA 320x200 256 color mode, but only for sake of compatibility, since EGA and MCGA are not cross-compatible, and otherwise still uses the 16 color assets. As for audio, it only supports the PC speaker and Tandy 3-voice sound chip. As for its current release date, it's still commercial, but you have a few options for acquiring it nowadays. Digital copies are available from both GOG and Steam, though they're split up differently. On GOG, it's part of a package including the first three Space Quest games for $10, whereas on Steam, it's part of a package including all 6 Space Quest games for $20. So either way, you're paying the same amount per game. Now, while I can't speak to the Steam release, the GOG release uses ScumVM by default instead of DOSBox, but it includes all of the necessary files to play the game through your own DOSBox instance if you prefer. If you want a physical copy though, ooh boy, be prepared to shell out some serious cash. Maybe it's just a matter of how ridiculous the market is right now, but physical copies of the original fully boxed releases of Space Quest 2 are extremely expensive, typically selling for between $70 and $150. And seeing as most copies you find from sellers online will be fully boxed, well, that'd be how you'd end up getting it. Now, I found evidence of a couple loose disc sales, which themselves still went for around $20. Or if you find one of the combo CDs, which contain multiple Space Quest games, those typically go for around $20 as well. But yeah, fair warning about all of that if you're wanting to get a physical copy. Space Quest 2 is a direct sequel to the original Space Quest. Now, at the end of the first game, our protagonist, Roger Wilco, is rewarded for his valiant efforts in stopping the Sarians from using the star generator to destroy the planet Xenon and all of its relatively peaceful inhabitants. Now, for some time, Roger enjoys the celebrity lifestyle, but alas, it doesn't last, and before long, he's once again forgotten and doomed to a life of cosmic janitorial duties. Now, Space Quest 2 starts off with Roger Wilco sweeping away some space dust outside of Xenon Orbital Station 4 when he's called in to report for cleanup duties on a shuttle which just came in, where apparently one of the occupants had come down with a case of space sickness. Now, the game's technically already started by this point, but as already pointed out, the game's a lot more cinematic in nature, so you don't actually do a whole lot before boarding the shuttle, getting clonked out by two big mean-looking guys inside, and then being brought face to face with an oddly disfigured individual going by the name of Vohaul. Apparently, Vohaul's come down with a serious case of vengeance, as he was the one who had invented the star generator and even intended it to be used as a weapon before the people of Xenon felt it would work out better as a peaceful scientific endeavor and forced the project out of his hands. Vohaul was also the mastermind behind the Sarian encounter of the first game, as it was his attempt to get the device back into his own clutches, but guess who went and foiled those plans? Yep, Roger Wilco. Now, Vohaul decides he doesn't want to kill you, though. He wants you to suffer, so he's sending you to a mining operation of his to spend the rest of your natural life. In the meantime, he's also preparing to enact his vengeance upon the people of Xenon, too, in the form of countless thousands of finely tuned, genetically engineered, door-to-door insurance salesmen. Yikes. Unfortunately for you, though, in the final moments of your captivity, it becomes apparent that Vohaul's got a knack for hiring idiots, as the hovercraft you're riding runs out of gas mid-flight, gets its first real taste of gravity, and the only person to survive the fall is Roger Wilco. And it's at this point that the cinematics are finally over with, and the gameplay truly begins. One other thing to quickly mention too is that this game comes with a comic book which goes over various moments of the first Space Quest, and even dives into Space Quest 2's story to a small extent. And yes, a scanned copy of this comic comes with the GOG release of the game, fake ads and all. Before we get into this, a quick question from one of my Patreon supporters, Simo Vahainen, asks, I'm just curious about how high this game and series rates amongst the Sierra adventure games in difficulty. Easier or as tough as King's Quest? And it's about on par, as you're going to see. Though I will say, because this game is extremely linear, the difficulty is more so related to not missing things, since you'll need almost every item in the game to win, as well as figuring out some tricky sections, but we'll get into that. As with all other Sierra AGI titles, the gameplay is a combination of a text parser with graphical aspects. You move around using a joystick or the numeric keypad, then type in the actions you wish to perform in plain English. In fact, the game can be quite picky about the way you type things in, since it's occasionally expecting some very specific responses. For instance, right after the crash landing at the start of the game, if you go up and look at the bodies of the guards who are holding you prisoner, you won't find anything special. And even if you say to examine them, same deal, nothing special will happen. However, if you explicitly say you wish to search a particular guard, then and only then will you find a key card to take. Now, this pickiness isn't really anything new. Heck, the original Space Quest had the exact same conundrum with trying to find a key card on a dead body. But there's more instances of this, one of the worst being in the swamp. Now, actually figuring out what to do to survive the swamp is tricky enough, but you're expected to somehow be able to stumble upon an unmarked spot which is deeper than the rest of the swamp, dive underneath, and make your way into a cave to grab a special object. But if you attempt this simply by telling the game you want to quote-unquote dive, you'll never make it. Instead, you explicitly have to say you want to hold your breath, and this will allow you to make it to where you need to go. For what is a short and highly linear game, there's moments like this scattered throughout, but most of them aren't too egregious, so long as you keep the manual handy, and not for the reason you might think. Now, there's a particular page in the manual which lists various commands that the game recognizes. You will need to use almost all of these in the course of beating the game, and given how few inventory items you get, trial and error will actually get you surprisingly far if you keep this particular vocabulary in mind. For instance, to get across the swamp, you need to find some rather disgusting berries and rub their contents all over yourself. The rub command is listed in this vocabulary here, so you will indeed consider using it if you remember to reference this page. The game does do some otherwise egregious things though from a mapping perspective. Like, take this screen for instance. There are 4 exits here which lead to different screens. Can you guess where they are? I mean, 2 are probably fairly obvious, going down and going to the left, but where are the other 2? Well, there's one here, and another here. Yeah, 2 separate ways to leave the screen off the right side which go to 2 completely different screens. Suffice to say, that's pretty evil, even if the map here is relatively small. And just like with the original Space Quest, there's about a gajillion ways to die. Permit me to demonstrate just a handful of them for your viewing pleasure. Yeah, one thing you're going to absolutely hate is the underground tunnel. You have to go through it in the dark, using only a glowing rock as a light source, and this labyrinth of tunnels is freaking huge. Although I did note that so long as you follow the left wall when you first ascend, you will ultimately get out without running into anything dangerous down here. And it takes longer than going the optimal route, but it's something you can do without a map. Eventually, you get off the planet and back into space, well, if you can figure out how to control these blasted shuttles, and end up being taken to an asteroid station. Now here, the game ramps up some of the ridiculousness, as just trying to get these elevators moving is a trip and a half. When you're inside, you're naturally going to look at the elevator to find out what buttons you can press to move it, but you're directed to a panel, so you look at the panel and see 4 buttons. Well, great, I'm going to push the first button, except whoops, the game doesn't recognize first or second or any of that, nor can you insert digits into the command parser. So now you have to look at the buttons themselves to see the labels and push the appropriate buttons by name. It's a bit of a runaround, to be sure. Ultimately, you'll figure things out, find your way up to Vohaul, deal with him appropriately, make your way through a long glass tube because that's definitely a safe thing to have on an asteroid station, and get up to the escape pod area where you'll suddenly have an alien burst out of your chest and end the game. Yeah, some of the Walking Dead moments aren't even that apparent. There's this weird alien you find on the 5th floor of the asteroid station, which will give you a massive kiss if you get near it, and once that happens, you're pretty much on a time limit before you die, and that time limit is just barely enough to clear the rest of the game if you know exactly what you're doing. So I had to replay a bunch of things to avoid that. But then that's it. This game only has 2 major sections, the jungle planet and the asteroid station, and that's pretty much it. The orbital station at the start is all of 4 screens, the jungle planet makes up the meat of the game, and the asteroid station has a lot of filler screens where pretty much nothing happens. This game heavily relies on its cinematic elements to carry what is otherwise a very simple story. Overall, Space Quest 2 isn't terrible, but it's definitely more story and visuals than gameplay compared to the first Space Quest game, and notably has less to do as a result of that. Now, I personally feel the first Space Quest is the better game of the two, but it's not like the sequel here is inherently bad, it's just different. That's still comparatively speaking though, since let's be real here, being able to miss critical items and end up walking dead right from the very start of the game, only to find out when you're about 60% through, is really dumb, and I'm glad adventure games ultimately steered away from this as a means to add quote-unquote replayability. Space Quest 2 runs perfectly fine in ScumVM, but if you're like me and prefer using DOSBox, then just leave cycle set to auto and you should be good, though you will have to turn off timed intervals if you intend to use a joystick or gamepad to move around. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up will be episode 292, debuting on Saturday, October 9th, where we're going to be taking a look at a city building game that's, well, a bit unusual to say the least, so be sure to stay tuned to see how such a game fares when it has nothing to do with Maxis. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small set of you guys.